Annyeonghaseyo. Sorry. Sorry for my accent. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. Thank you very much also for the organizers to welcome us here. I will not introduce myself. This has been done already. But I'm with CGAP, so we'll just introduce CGAP. We were created 15 years ago, and we are an international policy and research center for microfinance. I'll try to go slow for the interpreters. And we have 33 members. So we're housed at the World Bank, but we have 33 members which are international organizations. For example, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the United Nations, the European Commission, but also the bilateral international organizations like Australian Aid. Ruth is here representing them today. We have the French, the Germans, the Americans, most sort of rich countries that provide funding for microfinance abroad are members of CGAP. We have 8 offices, about 50 staff, so we're quite small, but very dynamic. And as you've seen, we produce a lot of publications. I see that all the publications that we brought here are already gone. They were on the table outside, but you can always find them on our website. They're all available there, and as you will see, there are new ones every month almost. So what do we do, CGAP? We don't really fund microfinance very much. We're more like a think tank, research center, and we set standards. So we work in 3 main areas. The first one is what we call market infrastructure, but it actually is mostly about technology. Tunç was mentioning technology in his speech. It's about using technology to bring financial services to poor people. Branchless banking, you've all heard about mobile phone banking, all this kind of area. We work a lot in this area. The second area of our work is to work with governments. Governments have an important role to play in terms of promoting access to finance, and we're working a lot with them. The third area is donors and investors, and it's an important, because we are member-based also, we work very closely with all the international donors and investors who fund microfinance. So these are kind of our 3, areas of work. Now, what kind of services do we provide? Well, first we do some experimentation. In branchless banking, for example, we have about a dozen, projects that experiment new technologies in microfinance. So we work in East Asia, but also in other regions. We provide standards and tools. CGAP is famous for developing good practice standards for the industry. That's what we've been known for many years. For example, Tunç mentioned the guidelines for regulation and supervision of microfinance, but we also have guidelines for donors and investors. We produce a lot of guidelines, like ISO for the industry. We try to do something like that. We also provide advisory and advocacy services to all the groups that I mentioned before. So advisory services, for example, to governments, but also to donors and investors. And finally, last but not least, we also provide data and analysis on the industry. So we really try to get a lot of accurate data, which is very difficult. Many people come up with data in this business, but it's very hard to produce high quality data. So that's one of the things we try to do. And I'll give some examples on data this afternoon, especially in terms of funding, because the issue of funding for microfinance and global crisis is something that has come up a lot already this morning, and I'll talk more about the figures this afternoon. Now, let's jump into the topic of the day, which is the global crisis and microfinance. So I'll try to define what we mean by global crisis at CGAP, then discuss about the resilience of microfinance, and then the effects of the crisis on clients, providers, investors, policymakers. And I'll finish with a couple of predictions. First, when we talk about global crisis, we have to think about 3 kinds of cumulative crises that have taken place in developing countries especially. The first one was the food crisis, and we started doing some surveys on the food crisis a while ago. It was it's sort of in 2009. One thing we found is that obviously the food crisis has a lot of effect in poor countries. Then there was the financial crisis, which was in the headlines more of the developed and the rich countries, because the closure of banks happened more in the US than in developing countries. So the financial crisis also affected, with the liquidity crunch, developing countries, but probably less, in my opinion, than food crisis, for example, and less probably than the actual global economic recession that followed the financial crisis. Because, of course, developing countries are less affected by what's happening in the US or in Europe, but when it comes to the banks, but when it comes to the economy, of course, a lot of the exports from developing countries to rich countries have been highly affected by the global economic recession. So now the second question is about microfinance in the global crisis, and I think as I will conclude, I'm sort of starting with the conclusion, but microfinance overall has been relatively resilient to the crisis, and I think we need to remember that. It has raised a lot of questions about microfinance, but overall we've not seen sort of the dozens of bank closures that we've seen in the US, for example, and the effects that we've seen in Europe during the financial crisis. So overall there's been a relative resilience to the global crisis, and I would say that overall the health of the microfinance sector is not fantastic, but it's not bad either. We have to be careful about sort of generalizing sometimes some problems that happen in a couple of countries. There are some issues, but we'll come back to that later. What we've seen is that especially deposit-taking institutions have been more resilient to the crisis, but at the same time, the crisis has had some impact on microfinance in several ways. Even though it's been resilient, again, there has been some issues, and I'm going to present some of these issues. So just to summarize, this has been, the crisis has had impact on the clients, on the providers of microfinance, and on investors. So I'll go into each area one after the other. And as you see on the top of this slide, we say it's difficult to establish causality. We should not try to find simple explanations for something that is quite complicated. And unfortunately, sometimes we can say, oh, this is because of the crisis, but maybe this is because of, political situations, maybe it's because of very specific economic situation in one particular area of a country. So we have to be cautious about, hasty conclusions on the impact of the crisis on microfinance. However, one thing that we can say for sure is that the clients have been affected by this triple crisis. For example, the number of malnourished people has increased by 25% in the world between 2008 and 2009. So this is a very significant impact of the crisis on poor people. And poor people spend about 50 to 70% of their income on food. So you can imagine that the first impact of the crisis has been that people eat less or less well. So that has been sort of the impact on the clients. Of course, the economic recession has also had impact on poor people in some countries, especially in countries that lived, for example, from export or from tourism. These countries have been impacted, and the clients, the poor people who used to live from this export industry, have been affected. Another factor that has affected poor clients has been the reduction of remittances. Remittances, for the first time in many years, from people who work abroad and send money home, this has been reduced for the first time in 2009, especially in some regions. Let's not forget that the impact is always different from one region to the other. But in Central Asia, for example, or in the MENA region, North Africa, this has created some issues because remittances can be a very important source of income for very poor people. So the decline of this, money transfers to poor people has affected their lives. Now, before I talk about the impact of the crisis on microfinance institutions, I want, because, we always talk about microfinance institutions, but what do we mean? In fact, it's a whole variety of institutions. You have NGOs, like in Bangladesh, ASHA, which has probably more than 2 million clients. Nimal knows better than me, but it's enormous now. You have commercial finance companies, you have financial cooperatives, you have commercial banks, you have a variety of government, owned or semi-owned institutions, and you have new players like telcos that are getting involved in providing financial access to poor people. So when we talk about microfinance institutions, we're talking about a huge diversity of institutions that provide savings, credit, microinsurance, transfer services to poor people. So it's quite broad. You have the example of Smile Bank here, but there are many other different types of institutions. So how have they been affected by the crisis? I know that some of my colleagues are going to talk about it more, so I'm not going to go very much in depth into this because I saw some other presentations that are going to put more emphasis on this. We have conducted several surveys at CGAP in the last year and a half, and one thing we have noticed is that there has been some liquidity constraints, especially we've seen in what we call Tier 2 and Tier 3 MFIs. And I know that Professor Park is going to get into these details of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. But just to say that there have been some liquidity constraints. But as I will present this afternoon, you will see that international funding actually has been relatively stable. So it's actually a very complicated situation. The portfolio quality of MFIs has deteriorated in 2009, especially in Europe, as you can see. So there is a growing portfolio at risk. I know that Séverine is going to talk about this more in our presentation, so I will not, insist too much on this. But the portfolio at risk have increased. I don't think this is dramatic from what we're seeing, but this is, an important element to consider. The growth of the sector and the profitability has slowed down also. And I think what we have to think about is that the crisis happened at a time when the industry was growing extremely fast. So you have, liquidity crunch at a time when the industry was growing at, 30% per annum or this kind of figures. So the growth, has diminished since then. And it has implications also on the funding. But it's important to think that when the crisis happened, the industry was growing extremely fast, and in fact, many believed that it was growing too fast. So some of the issues happened not only just because of the crisis, but also because the industry was growing very fast, and in somewhat called now uncontrolled growth. When we look at the overall markets, the markets have become more risky with increasing portfolio at risk. And that means that investors have been a little more careful, but at the same time, the investment has not completely vanished. And in fact, as you will see, there is more investors than before. So as you can see, we've seen some collapses in certain countries like Morocco, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Montenegro. But we should not think that these accidents that have happened in some markets are only due to the crisis. If you take Pakistan, for example, it was a combination of, I believe, sort of weak management, but also political intervention that affected, Kashif Foundation. So, it's not always one cause that creates the issue, unfortunately. So it's not that simple. But what we can see is that maybe the crisis has sort of emphasized some of the existing issues of, uncontrolled growth and other issues like, growing portfolio at risk that are also associated somehow with uncontrolled growth, but also, the difficulty of the clients that are being affected by the economic recession. So, return on equity is going down. I know that Severin is also going to show this slide, so I will not go, much in depth. Although we have to be careful not to generalize, because this specific study has been done on a very small sample of institutions. But we're seeing, some declining returns on investment. However, even though the investors are more prudent, as you can see on this slide, the investment funds are still growing. In 2010, they're expected to grow by 15% in 2010. They've continued to grow in 2009. These funds that kind of didn't exist about 10 years ago have all appeared in the last 10 years. We're now at more than 100 funds, and they're still investing in microfinance. 8 MFIs have been created in 2009, 8 new funds. So microfinance overall remains an attractive market for investors despite the crisis. So that means we have to have very nuanced messages, because even though there are some issues, investors are still interested and they're still growing. And I'll give more detail this afternoon when we talk about investment and donor funding. But overall, investment and international donor funding has continued to grow in spite of the crisis. Now, when we look at the government response to the crisis, we conducted a survey last year on this. And what we found, and that's related with what people said this morning, is that usually we say that the role of the government is mostly to protect, the sector, protect depositors, and create an enabling regulatory environment. But in times of crisis, some other actions may be justified. And for example, we've seen that many governments have, during the crisis, provided liquidity funds to microfinance through what we call Apex and wholesale funds, but also with guarantee funds and subsidized lending. There have been other measures that have been taken, but overall, what we need to remember about government response is that it's been, relatively, I would say, positive compared with what we expected. And it's been mostly focused on providing liquidity, which in times of crisis, again, I think is relatively justified. I don't think it would be justified all the time, but in times of crisis, that can be an interesting government intervention. It's difficult. We've noticed about 26 countries that took some measures during the crisis in the area of microfinance, but it's always difficult to link the intervention with the crisis. Sometimes the crisis just accelerates something that was planned before. I will not present this slide, but it's I wanted to go more in depth into some other things we've seen, an increasing focus, for example, on the social agenda. I would say that all segments of the industry have increased their focus on the social agenda, during the crisis. For example, the Philippines, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka all put in place some financial literacy programs, which is a good indication of a shift in the microfinance sector. For the last several years, the microfinance industry had become increasingly commercial, and the crisis has, had some good implications in a way on the sector by, focusing more on the social aspects of microfinance, and also which is at the origin of microfinance, and on protecting the consumers. Okay, I'll go quickly on this. So the most positive aspect of the crisis, in my opinion, is that it has really strengthened its origin objective of double bottom line. Microfinance started, Philippe will tell us in his presentation about the history of microfinance, but it really started with both a social and a financial objective. Its origins are very, very far away, way before Grameen Bank, and it always was something that was supposed to help poor people, but at the same time be financially viable. So this double bottom line we call triple now because of the environment also, but this double bottom line is really been put back on the table. It has pushed the industry to become more responsible, and if you go to international conference, responsible is the word that you hear every 10 minutes. But it's a good thing because it was time for the industry to be more responsible. So the crisis has highlighted, for example, over-indebtedness, the lack of consumer protection, maybe the lack of emphasis on social return as well as financial return. And this global crisis has brought this back. And in fact, it is illustrated, for example, by what we call the consumer protection principles that have been adopted by many investors and donors. It is also illustrated by a lot of governments that are putting in place consumer protection measures in many countries, and we're working with them on this. And it's also illustrated by the G20 principles that Ruth Goodwin will present later. So before I finish, I'm 1 minute late, I'm sorry, just a couple of predictions. We are going to see slower growth in the industry, which is probably a good thing because fast growth can be harmful also. We might see a couple of other delinquency crises. Severin will go more in depth into the portfolio at risk issue, but there are some chances that there will be more crises, although I think we'll be nowhere close from what we've seen in rich countries in terms of crisis. There will be also a divide between social and commercial microfinance. I believe that somehow those actors that don't take into account social returns and the social part of microfinance are going to face some issues. We're also going to be a lot of change with the branches banking players, the telco companies. Tunç was mentioning 1.7 billion people who don't have access to finance but will have access to mobile phone technologies. And in fact, I strongly believe that the phone is going to become, if not, it's becoming already the computer of the poor. So I'm doing my banking on a computer, and I think the poor are going to be doing their banking on their phone in the future. And the final prediction is that domestic market funding is going to increase. We talked a lot about savings this morning. I think there is going to be more emphasis on this. Saving is not only very important for microfinance institutions to fund themselves, but it's also an extremely important service for the poor. So to conclude, I will just say that a crisis is only good if we learn from it. And I'm hoping, and that's true for our own lives, I think, and that's true also for economic crisis. I think the Asian crisis was an example. This one is an example. I think the microfinance sector is learning from it, and that in that sense, I think this is a good crisis for the microfinance sector, despite all the very negative impact it has had on poor people. I hope it will have some positive things. Kamsahamnida. Thank you.